I started with questions of what was wrong with me, why would I want to be a teacher? And then that led to some other questions and some other answers about how my perspectives as a hip-hop cultural practitioner informed what I do and what I don't do in the classroom. So since my graduate studies at Temple University, working with Mark Hill, working with Emery, working with Joycelyn, here we're about, tinkering and transforming these spaces, whether it's secondary methods courses like the one we're teaching right now, or whether it's developing new trans and interdisciplinary programs like the YES program that I mentioned earlier.
Hey everybody, I'm sitting in traffic, Atlanta traffic, but I'm happy to be here to engage in this first webinar. I am Joycelyn Wilson, and I'm in the School of Literature, Media, and Communications at Georgia Tech, and in the Black Media Studies program that's there. And I took a different route. I pivoted. I started my work in a school and college of education, and a few years ago, I took a route to be in a media and communications department because of the work that I'm doing around hip hop studies, hip hop pedagogies, and digital media. So at Georgia Tech, I teach classes around interactive narrative. I teach experimental digital art, and I teach documentary film. So I do a lot of maker stuff now that's based on an interactive archive I have based around a bunch of about 5,000 vinyl records, and it's now turned into an interactive space that people can access pedagogical resources, teachers can access pedagogical resources, students produce podcasts that can be used in the classroom. So for me, I pivoted to the design side, the pedagogical design side, because I'm very much interested in the archiving of the culture and the way in which pedagogy informs archives, and the way in which we can utilize lyrics and conceptual frameworks that artists give us through their storytelling, and package those to teach design classes. So I'm using hip hop culture now, hip hop pedagogies now, to not only teach social justice and of course humanistic inquiry, but to also help students design products that are culturally informed by hip hop, not necessarily hip hop products, but are informed, the way they go about designing them are informed by hip hop. So that's a little bit about me. But at the heart, I am a teacher and pedagogue. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. That was a great intro, and also I think a wonderful segue into our first question. So I imagine most of us, if not all of us here in this webinar tonight, remember when hip hop, or have some notion of hip hop not being mainstream, right? Not being super popular, being considered a subculture, and something that was, not readily accepted by all. And now we're sort of seeing hip hop ed as a movement, right? That you could talk about it and people might know what you're talking about, at least in the education field. Increasingly, we see it in commercials, right? We see a lot of publications and workbooks that are sort of dedicated to hip hop education. And so I'm wondering, for those of you, our panelists who have been in this field for a while, who've seen it grow, how you see the popularity of hip hop education impacting the field of hip hop education. And before you answer, as you're thinking about your answers, I do want to give a shout out to Dr. Bettina Love and Dr. Goldie Mohammed, who are speaking tonight in ATL. And so they can't join us tonight, but that's also really powerful social justice work that's happening, and make sure we honor that as well.
I guess one thing I would mention to start off is I think the increased popularity has created some new challenges, and one of those new challenges is getting folks past just the surface, most simplistic aspects of hip hop, which is just basic rhyme. So I think about instances when I'll do it in service or talk with teachers about just what I think is some exciting and innovative things. And inevitably somebody will come up afterwards and be like, yeah, like, you know, that's great, but I got to tell you about this great thing happened in my classroom where I have students, read a chapter, and write a rap about it, or to memorize it for the test, so it's this moment when I don't want to just dismiss that, but it's the most superficial, elementary aspect of hip hop, and I wouldn't even. It's not even endemic to hip hop. Rhyme is something that is hip hop doesn't own rhyme. So I think the growth and popularity of it creates that challenge of wanting to start where some folks are, where some educators are, but also really rapidly pushing past the most simplistic representation of the culture in order to get them moving deeper and really educating themselves about the richness and nuances of hip hop, and then how that translates over to the classroom.
Y'all can just jump in. You have to raise your hand or anything. You can just start or pick up.
So I would agree with Emery. I think that the growth and popularity of using hip hop culture in the classroom is now on a spectrum. And I think that we have to understand that it's really a design issue at this point. What Emery brings up is a design issue. It's the question of, how do you talk to that teacher who really doesn't understand the culture and only understands it in the sense that her or his students are impacted by it and they want to bring it into the classroom and have absolutely no idea how to do it other than that elementary way of taking some sort of concept and putting it to rhythm and rhyme so that students understand it. So you have that spectrum. You also have on the other side of that, in the way in which hip hop is being used, the popularity of it is now informing the design of products, and also being taught in humanities departments where, for me in particular, at a tech institute of technology. So you have students that are coming in who are engineering majors primarily. They are either math majors and very, very much heavy in STEM and need a humanities elective, but not realizing that the use of hip hop culture to even talk about the way in which they go about engaging in their engineering practice can be informed by culture. So there's a spectrum now, it really, in the spirit of hip hop, you have to really pay attention to the audience. And sometimes you have to give some people the applesauce before you give them the apple. Some you can give them the apple because they may have some sort of experience with hip hop. There are those who don't. And so with the growth of the field, we have to understand that there's the analysis of the lyrics on one end, which still is very valid. And in my case, I still use the analysis of those lyrics to have much bigger and broader conversations. But then on the other side, it's like, how do you take the concepts that are coming out of those lyrics to develop conceptual and theoretical frameworks that are very much grounded in the issues that hip hop talks about? So I would agree that, now we're dealing with a spectrum of how to literally use hip hop to design particular resources, lessons, activities, and experiences based on who you're dealing with.
Thanks. Dr. Hall, you have anything to add?
Now, I would say that with anytime that you widen the net, right, it creates opportunities, and it creates possibilities, and it also creates pitfalls, right? And so the more that hip hop, again, it's easier to make the case. I remember when I was first exploring this stuff way back in, 2006, 2007, you were really fighting against the pressures of convention, right? And now conversely, now there's the dangers of it being a fad, and I don't want to lead you on to the next question too much, but I feel like there's more doors that have been opened, more folks who don't look like me or you, Daren, who are occupying more of the space and changing those narratives and diversifying those narratives in ways that need to be done, really in really important ways. But with the increased popularity, right, it also comes with chances for pitfalls, right? And for me, as an old head, right, as part of that receding hairline, some of it's still there, receding hairline hip hopper, I'm trying to be mindful of how my generational positionalities, right, are maintaining those opportunities for different perspectives to come into my classroom, while being mindful of those issues that come with canonization and allowing some things in and some things out. And that's particularly pertinent when I think about scholarship, well, not only what my teaching in the classroom, but when I think about the work we do as peer reviewers, right? And the various scholarship that we're working on as well.
Thank you for that. You used the word fad in your answer. You know, you didn't want to allude to our next question, but let's move on to that. So let's think about the notion of whether we're thinking about the academies, sort of higher ed, or in K-12 or wherever, right? This notion of, is hip hop ed something that's too narrow of a focus in terms of how to do education or schooling? Is it something that'll just, it's sort of, I don't know, akin to some of the arguments people had about hip hop itself before, that it's a fad, and then once hip hop goes away, right? And what use will hip hop ed be? So I just want to hear people's thoughts about the notion of its utility, and arguments either around the notion of it being too narrow or too faddish of a tool or pedagogy to use in education.
Definitely not too narrow. I mean, hip hop is the mainstream, and I think that is something that influences the way in which it's done in academia. I mean, if we just think about culture, period, and not so much about the hip hop part of that, but just culture and the way in which culture intersects with pedagogy. I mean, that's just, we know that basically as researchers that they go hand in hand. So I don't think that it's too narrow. I think that hip hop has so many access points and so many ways that it can be utilized to teach a spectrum, a range of things that I see in the future. I'm going to jump out here and say this, but just as much hip hop is the mainstream on the popular scene, I could see hip hop becoming the mainstream in the way in which we educate our new teachers, the way that we go about developing our designers. I would go so far to say that I don't know if that will happen in my lifetime or after we all retire, but I believe that hip hop in the academy or hip hop in schools has the ability to completely shift the way in which we teach and learn. So I would say that I don't believe that it's too narrow. I think that it is the framework that we should be using.
And if I might,
across the board.
If I might build upon that, I was, well, first of all, like, we here now, right? So we ain't going away, right? I'm in this motherfucker now. We can be real. Can we be real like that? I hope. Okay, thank y'all. We here now, right? Again, I remember when Emery's beard was a lot less gray, right? When I couldn't even grow a beard, right? And we're here now, right? So even I was teaching a writing and pop culture class today, and we were talking about feminist approaches, examining Queen Latifah's UNITY alongside Cardi B's Bodak Yellow, right? 2 Grammy award-winning hip-hop artists. And we talked about Queen Latifah, right? And her evolution, right? That she came into the game as a ferocious MC, right? And she was genius at that. And then, but that is not all she was, right? And then when she evolved and turned into what most of the folks in this room would recognize her more so as an artist, I would argue that she is no less hip hop today, right? Operating in those spaces as she was when she was ripping the mic, right? So for me, I remember those early conversations, those early thoughts with some of my mentors on, are we putting all of our eggs in one basket? I've heard people try to dissuade me, say, you think this is something that you can do for a 30, 40, year career?
Yep.
Hell yeah, right? And again, that work is changing and that is evolving as we evolve and move through these spaces, right? So again, this might be considered an additive approach to an English education course, right? But at the same time, I am carving out entirely new institutional spaces, which whether they say hip hop pedagogy on the front of them, right? Or whether they're Trojan horse and cloaked, through the back door, right? That shit is hip hop, right? And whether we're raging down and kicking down the door or being subtle with it, it's not going anywhere, right? They messed around and gave the wrong brothers and sisters PhDs, and now they're gonna pay for
it. I'd add on to the question real quick. Too narrow. I think it can be as narrow or as broad to fit somebody's particular needs. So we talk about narrow. Kenneth just dropped in the chat that he's teaching. I guess he's teaching a hip hop history course next year in high school. Somebody could teach a hip hop literature 4-week unit in an English class, or maybe it's in a social studies class and they're teaching, something on protest. So they're doing it around hip hop activism. Or we could have high school of the recording arts, which is the whole school is built around, recording, not just hip hop, but certainly hip hop centric. So I think narrow or broadness the answer to that can be in response to whatever the particular education need is, and really the space that is allowed for within that particular context, especially with, say, the leadership in a school, where maybe in a school context where they're like, yeah, like we need a whole hip hop literature elective course, do it. Or you might be in a spot where really it's just a week-long unit, or it's a month-long unit, which is the foot in the door. So I think broadness and narrowness can really depend upon the particular needs and responses to needs.
Emery, you bring up a good point. You two things you said: space and leadership. And I think that when we talk about the narrowness or the broad nature of hip hop, it really does boil down to where you are and what you're allowed to, what not. And I'm doing aloud while I'm driving, in air quotes, what you are allowed and supported to do in your teaching. So, for instance, in LMC, I teach, my classes are not listed as intro to hip hop studies or exploring the politics of trap music. Like, those are concepts and themes that are threaded into a course that's listed as science, race, and technology. So if you have a PhD and you're trained, so to speak, to be able to use hip hop in the classroom, then it doesn't matter what the general concept is or what the general title of the class is. It all boils down to the way in which you're going to use hip hop as a design technique in the way in which you teach. So the way I might teach science, race, and technology might not be the same. It's not the same. It's not the same as when some of my other colleagues teach that class. So that broad nature that you're talking about is really supported by the people who allow or will support that type of instruction. And the institution I was at before would not support that. So the space, the people, the leadership is going to impact whether or not it's going to impact that narrowness or that broad nature for the class or for what you're teaching. I mean, we're to the point now in my department where you know, the popularity of hip hop education in higher ed is forcing us to think about, well, do we need a thread, a hip hop studies thread that will allow for there to be some sort of specific approach just to using and studying hip hop studies and studying the field? But that has been because of the space and the leadership supporting the way in which it gets integrated into these broad classes.
If I could throw in here too, just for the secondary or elementary public school teachers who are on this right now, a good kind of tool of justification if you're in a context that looks at hip hop ed work as really suspicious. And I stole this from Jeff Duncan Andrade. I saw him do it with something else. But what you can do is ask your administrators, do we want our students to go to Cornell, to Harvard, to Georgia Tech, to Atlanta? Like, name all these institutions that have hip hop archives, which is University of Houston, Cornell, Harvard, William and Mary. Name the institutions that have archives or programs. Say, do we want to prepare our students to go to these places? And of course, your administrator is going to be like, yeah, of course. Okay, well, this is what these institutions are doing. So if we're going to prepare our students to go there, this is the kind of education we have to expose them to. That's a really hard thing to argue against.
Yep, I agree.
So thank you everyone. Something I'm realizing is I find very powerful about this conversation is the same questions that come up in hip hop ed are, for me at least, the same questions that I have about hip hop as a culture. And Daren and I have had extensive conversations. We haven't come to an answer, but about this notion of what does it mean? What does it look like to grow old in hip hop, right? I shouldn't say old, just to evolve within, to be more mature within hip hop. And it seems like that's a similar question for hip hop ed, right? What does it look like over time to be in this work? And I really appreciate, especially the example of someone like Queen Latifah, right? So it's less about how do I stay relevant in this thing, but how does this thing grow and expand also to fit me, right? And what I'm doing, the moves I'm making, is this notion of not just sticking within this narrow focus, but how do we expand it through the work, I think is powerful. And so similarly, it also makes me think about, there are questions within hip hop culture of who can enter this, right? Like, what are the prereqs? Can anyone just come in and be hip hop, do hip hop, make a song? Do we trust them? And I think similarly, those same questions come up for educators, right? And to your point, Emery, those who are middle school, high school, even elementary educators who are thinking about how do I do this work, something that I've heard a lot is this, I guess, anxiety around or nervousness around doing hip hop ed work if you don't feel like you are hip hop, right? So, our panelists, from the way that I know you, you're an MC, you're a poet, you're a DJ, you've sort of had hip hop identities forever, but there are teachers that are like, it's not really how I grew up, right? That's not my thing, it's not how I identify. Am I allowed to do this work? If so, how can I do this work? So my question to you all, or our question is, are there prereqs for being a hip hop educator? Are there competencies? Are there things that people need to enter with? Are there people who just can't or shouldn't do it because they don't carry certain identities or experiences? What do you think?
Well, I'll jump in on the question. I think let me add another piece to it, because is the educator, are they hip hop, but also are the students hip hop? And I think that what we're talking about is impacting the students. So for me, it is about the teacher in the classroom being able to recognize how his or her students are impacted by culture, whether that culture is popular culture, and hip hop culture is popular culture. So being able to recognize and sense how they're influenced by it. As an educator, I'm looking for that more than I'm looking for whether or not the actual teacher is a hip hop practitioner. I want to be able to work with teachers who are able to see that their students are recognized by it, and then, are influenced by it, and then provide them resources that they need to be able to use hip hop in the classroom. And I think going back to that first question around where we're going and how the field is grown and where that spectrum lies. Part of the archive that we have at Georgia Tech is around designing and providing those pedagogical resources for that teacher that's like, you know, I'm not really into hip hop and I don't identify as a hip hop practitioner, but my students do. So what are some of the resources that I can bring into the classroom that are aligned with certain standards that impact my students? So I'm mainly looking for that teacher that is able to say, I acknowledge, I validate, and I value the cultural influences and nuances brought into my classroom for my students. It's not about the teacher as much as, for me, it's not so much about the teacher as much as it is about the student.
And if I might, again, I see a comment. Authenticity is important.
Authenticity is very important.
And sometimes keeping it real means knowing what you cannot do, right?
I agree with that.
So being nervous, right? And again, excuse me for pointing out, if my comrades who are sitting at this table with me, if they know that they are a hip hop cultural outsider, right? That they know that they have varying, prior knowledge, through pop culture, right? The first thing that they should do, right, is think about what don't I know, right, before we get in this car and start driving. Follow me? So the first thing, pausing is okay, and it is highly encouraged, right, because you need to think about what we're doing before we start doing it, right, and try to foresee what different type of issues can come about. Now, based on my scholarship, based on my observations of student teachers and whatnot, those varying backgrounds manifest themselves in a couple of different ways, right? That in my class, we talk a lot about effective teachers or effective social justice educators are a reflection of their dispositions, their knowledge, and their skills, right? And we think about that knowledge, right? I talk about it in terms of canonical knowledge and cultural knowledge, right? That as a hip hop cultural insider, I have a vault of materials that I've learned largely outside of school that I can pull from, right? To make random connections between Kendrick Lamar's Damn album that was released a couple of years ago to something that was released 20 years ago, right? And everyone around this table is well aware that they're not going to get that canonical knowledge from an institution like the one that we're sitting in, right? But I can give them some of that, right? Part of my job is to help them know what has a functional purpose, right? But the other side of that is the cultural knowledge, right? The other unspoken aspects that may not be revealed in the black ink on the white paper, right? Or in the physical practice itself, right? That the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice, right? That's a narrative that goes way back that helps, that rehashes uncomfortable and painful memories about cultural politics and racial politics or whatnot, right? So we can give them the canonical, right? But we also need to give them the cultural to maximize the achievement. Same with the skills, right? That every person around this table is going to walk out of here with the understanding of Wiggins, Matai, and the Citrus Poise of backwards design, right? They can do they will have the instructional skills, right? The question will be, will they have the interpersonal skills, right, as a white teacher to call out a white student for engaging in a particular stereotype, right? Or possess the knowledge and or confidence and or skills to tell a black kid his history, right? And again, some of my former teachers have been reluctant and nervous about telling black kids what it is, right? But if we're being hip hop, right, that's what we gotta do, right? So again, and thinking about it in terms of canonical and cultural knowledge, right, and equipping them with that, as well as instructional skills, as well as interpersonal skills.
Couple things I'd add on to that. I love this question. I have so much to say. So I think as long as you're not mocking or mimicking something, then that takes care of a lot of anxieties. But I also think that taking an inquiry or exploratory stance towards something also, as an educator, removes us from being in a position of having to feel like we know it all, and then that might make you perpetrate in some ways. So that inquiry, exploratory stance tends to put us side by side with our students and coming to understand something together rather than them looking at us for all the answers. So I think that's a really useful disposition too. I teach, one of the programs I teach in is a English education program. So I wrestle with this question with my undergraduate students a lot, some of the anxieties that they may experience in engaging hip hop in these ways. And I bring them through this thought experiment. I say, okay, so how many of you are going to probably teach a Jane Austen novel? And they all raise their hands. Some are really excited about it, some are not. So I say, okay, so how many of you are worried about, are experiencing anxiety or worry because you're not down with late 1700s British culture, right? And of course, none of them are experiencing anxieties about teaching Pride and Prejudice because of that. So I say, why are you experiencing this around hip hop? You actually are living in the age of hip hop, but you're experiencing lots of anxieties around this culture. You're experiencing lots more landmines and pitfalls and tripwires. So why is that the case? And what that does is, in some ways, that helps assuage some of these anxieties. But I think what it also does is it helps us to get into, especially for my white students, how they're feeling in their gut and bodies, the history of white people appropriating Black culture or misrepresenting it. And that's not something that they can always consciously articulate, but it's informing their felt reactions to what these pitfalls are. And once we name that, and then kind of, talk about it a little bit, whether it's a quick and dirty history of minstrelsy and minstrel shows, that then I think helps them to understand what they're experiencing more, and then how a solution for them is to really take a more inquiry or exploratory approach to this, which moves them out of the position of having to act like they know it all, or like they have to show and prove that this is part of who they are in order to teach this, because that's not something they have to do to teach other things. And of course, Tasha dropped a really important comment here in the chat about inviting in local, what I call, hip hop elders, right? People in that location who have been doing it for a long time, or maybe they're not doing it anymore, but they were before, and just asking them to tell their story, because every region has a history of hip hop, and sometimes those regional histories are overshadowed by what young folks and ourselves learn just in mainstream media. So understanding that as an educator, you're not the one who has to have it all. If you're meeting and bringing in folks from the region and the area, then that tends to take a lot of that authority away from you in a really necessary way.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that thought experiment too. I might have to try that one out.
Yeah, it's like, why are you feeling this?
Right. So here's another one that me and Lauren have been like really wrestling back and forth with for a few months or maybe even longer, right? So, the hip hop, sort of dating myself, the hip hop that I came up with, I think that a lot of us came up with, I think, there's always been a range of types of hip hop style, content, etc. So we're never going to say that. I think it is fair to say, like, in that so-called golden era of hip hop, when I was coming up with it, there was a lot of, explicit sort of consciousness raising, lyrics and content and aesthetics that were part of the culture, if that makes sense, right? And I think it's also fair to say, and I'm also willing to just say, maybe I'm just getting old and I just need, I'm trying to break out of this a little bit. But I do think there's been a shift, right, in the ways that hip hop culture, music, lyrics are manifesting these days, if I want to play the role of like cranky, get off my lawn type hip hop head, I might say like, oh, maybe the mainstream hip hop today is, pedantic, not very critical, steeped in, hyper materialism and so on and so forth. Or not, right? But I guess the question is given this, I think it's fair to say in the mainstream shift of messaging that we're seeing, and maybe even sound and aesthetic that we're seeing in hip hop, what does that mean for what hip hop education looks like today? I hope that makes sense. I can add more context if need be.
Should we add more context? Oh, you're okay.
No.
Oh,
no, I'm sorry. I was deferring for a second. So I'm 39 years old, and I make a conscious effort to remind myself, right, that hip hop at its infancy, right, was a youth culture, right, and that I find people of our generation, right, they are making the exact same argument that our parents and old head cousins were making about what was wrong with hip hop in the 1980s and it not being real music, right? And I am mindful that every time that I position myself as part of the golden age, right, as I position myself with real folk hip hop culture, right, and in effect distancing myself, right, from the youth, right, I am old heading myself. Right, I am turning myself into a hip hop conservative, right, that is trying to hold on to some aspect of the past, largely for nostalgic reasons, right? And if I'm being real, most of the stuff that I was listening to in the late 80s and early 90s was not all about fighting the power, right? I'm sorry, but before we was getting crunk, right, we was doing that no limit stuff, right? So hip hop is not a cultural Eden, right? And it's about peace, love, unity, and having fun. And sometimes we have fun in some disgusting ways that involve strip clubs and blowing money and all this stuff, right? But hip hop has never been this cultural Eden, right? Now, does it look and sound very different today? Hell yes, right? Hell yes. But for me, it creates as many opportunities. So it creates opportunities. For me, one thing I love about today's hip hop is I love the text that it provides for us, for how hip hop has reimagined how masculinity looks. And again, this comes from a skinny dude, 180 pounds, who used to wear size 38, 40, you know what I mean? I see you clapping there, right? The pants could not be any bigger, right? They had to cover the whole butter, Tim, right? Not just the top of it, like you see them stuffed in it now, right? And to see the face or the performance of masculinity change in ways that if you had told me in 1998 that I would have jeans on as tight as they are, right? I would slap the charge, right? And for me, while the content is still problematic, yes, we still, again, used to be a little bit of weed, now it's all the syrup and stuff. And again, those aspects are very dangerous and we need to address them. I do everything in my power, right, that when I am being critical, I am not doing so in ways that reflect my generational and ideological positionality more so than the students. And the second that I poo-poo 21 Savage is another one of those mumble rappers is the day that I become another teacher. Instead of depositing dead old white men, now I'm depositing maybe dead hip hop. And again, depositing is not why we're supposed to be doing this.
I think one thing I would add on to that is, I think the commonality across these generational differences is affect and feeling. So you listen to how, like, Bernard was talking about, the music of his generation, and you could hear the excitement and the feeling and the affect there. And and for, for his, for his students, if he were teaching high school or whatnot, there's sonically, musically, aesthetically, there might be some key differences, and we could get like really into those, like syncopated snare drums and whatnot, like triples. Like we could really get into the technicalities of those. But one of the common links there is affect and feeling, right? Everybody feels. So I think that's a really necessary bridge sometime, especially I think for me and for folks of my generation, educators, of looking at students and seeing that feeling and the excitement that they have for that music, even though aesthetically I can't necessarily relate to it in a similar way. It doesn't give me that same feeling, but like I sure remember and still experience that feeling when I hear, Jimmy Cash's Has Just Begun, you know what I mean? Or something like that. So I think affect and feeling is a really important link there. And I have to say too, like I've only started thinking about that. I don't think Jay Rawls is on this chat, but Jay Rawls, who's the music producer, who's now, he has his PhD. That's really kind of something that he started understanding through his dissertation, which was a study of kind of, this, OG hip hop guy, educator, and how does he negotiate this, this quote unquote hip hop generational gap in his classroom. And one of the things just through working with Rawls on his diss is that he saw the feeling and excitement in his students, and that kind of kept him from just judging and dissing their music. He didn't never judge their music, but seeing, wow, this is something they're passionate about. I remember how I was. That was a really important link right there. And I think too, there's important links about across those generations of thinking about like how would Chuck D mentor 21 Savage, right? How would Lauryn Hill mentor Cardi B, right? Like asking our students those questions, because then that gets them thinking across hip hop generations as well, and actually exploring who some of these people are who they might not necessarily know. And it doesn't necessarily presume that the folks who they're passionate about are these bad objects or don't have it together. It just creates more of a way to think across generations.
So I'm sitting here and I'm listening, and I'm like, we're saying hip hop today, the hip hop of today, and the hip hop of today mainly is driven by a Southern sound and Southern artists. We mentioned 21 Savage, I think I heard mumble rap, so the subtext, I believe, of the question is rooted in my geographic location right now, because I think the South, in terms of aesthetic and sound, is really impacting the production of the music. So what we're talking about is another design issue around the way in which we understand hip hop in its contemporary and its classic ways, and how it's used pedagogically and how it's leveraged pedagogically. In my science, race, and technology class, which is very diverse in terms of ethnic, race, gender, I'm constantly asked the question, when are we going to get to the Migos, Dr. Wilson? Like, when are we going to talk about, Future? When are we going to get to, and these are the artists that they are listening to, whether they are analyzing these texts or whether or not they're dancing to this music at a frat party on a Friday night. This is the music that they're impacted by. And it's important for us to leverage our positions, which we're very fortunate to be in. I really embrace the fact that I grew up during the first wave of hip hop, because I have the ability to be able to make connections that they don't necessarily even have the experience, the biological experience to even make, because most of these students, and I'm using 94 only because This is when we get Outkast. This is when we get Illmatic. Like, they weren't even born. So it's really important for us to not really fall victim to the, I guess, the ego that comes with, oh, that's their music, or that's not our music, because it is. I think that one of hip hop's greatest discoveries is trap music, because of the way in which trap is going to allow us to have a larger conversation, not just about the music that they are currently listening to, but the impact and the way in which that idea of trap allows us to be able to understand the trajectories and the different forms of Black music. So trap allows us to make some connections that we weren't really able to necessarily able to make. Today in class, students compared B.B. King's Chains and Things to Good Kid, Mad City to Ice Cube's A Bird in Hand, because A Bird in Hand and Good Kid, Mad City sample Chains and Things. But how do we move beyond making those musical connections and look at the ideological connections that these songs are making? And I have found that when I'm able to create a space where they are able to make those types of connections and really look at ideological sampling, they begin to make connections about the music that we weren't necessarily able to make because it didn't exist at the time. So I think we have to be really careful about how we divide generations of music and put hip hop in schools. Of course, that's what we do. I mean, school is one of the major tropes of hip hop. We put it in schools. We use schooling language to talk about it. We're on a call right now looking at the intersections of hip hop with school and education and pedagogy and all those types of things. And I think that there's so much more value in that than to say, well, I don't really connect with 21 Savage. I think when 21 Savage was detained by ICE, that was a great opportunity for people to see him in a very different way and to listen to his music in a very different way that maybe it got turned off before because the way in which he was delivering his lyrics. So I think we have to be really, really careful not to divide the music, because it's very much connected, and those connections are what we need in order to do this work.
Thank all of you for your answers to that. I just want to be clear, just I'm actually have more like I'm hip hop has brought more joy. Like where hip hop is right now is actually, I'm more hopeful about hip hop than ever before. So I was really just trying to ask a question and trying to think about a dynamic that I think is out there. But I really appreciate all y'all answers to that, because I think a lot of wisdom in all of that.
Can I add one thing on there?
Please.
Yeah. So I just love the connection Joycelyn made to just the musical connection through sampling from B.B. King to Kendrick to Outkast, and there might have been something else I missed in there. Just for folks who kind of might be coming into this, there's a great website that I'll drop in the chat called whosampled.com. So it's everything's connected now in the web, and it's just a way to help you to see in what songs have been sampled for other songs. And as kind of a DJ and record person, it makes me kind of like mad that all this sacred knowledge that you could only get by like just hard earned time and like meeting the right people, like now it's just all on the website. But it's incredible. So much knowledge. So just like that's in the chat, drop into there. You could literally just like put in the Migos new song and see like, oh my goodness, it samples this and this, and you'll be, all of a sudden you'll be back to like, 1965, and musically you can kind of make those connections there. And there's just a lot of good educational affordances that then lends.
And then the ideological sampling, you know, when we talk about sampling, usually we're talking about the music, but one of the things that you can do in class is, you know, or with your students so that they can make the connections, particularly this generation, is, you know, if you take a lot, 21 Savage is a lot, we know that, you know, it's sampling from Fuzz and I think another group, I can't remember, Epic Underground, I can't remember who they got it from, but one of the things that you can then do is have students get the lyrics from all of those different songs and see where are they talking about the same thing? Where are they departing ideologically? Do we hear any of the same sentiments in the 21 Savage version that we're hearing in the version of the Fuzz? Like, how do we talk about themes of love and open-mindedness, you know, and justice in the 21 Savage version that was released, 2019 versus the 1971 version that was released by the Fuzz. So I think that there's a way that we can talk about ideological sampling that extends that conversation that Emery's talking about once you are able to see where the connections lie in these songs musically. Those three songs that I said earlier, Chains and Things, 1970, Ice Cube's My Bird in Hand, I think is 91, and then you got Good Kid, Mad City. They're all talking about poverty. They're all talking about a lot of the same issues around truth and injustice, and engaging students in those types of activities really elevates them and begins to get them to engage in old school or classic hip hop along with contemporary hip hop and other forms of music, to be quite honest.
Thank you for that. So folks, what we're gonna do is, and I also appreciate for Dr. Hall and Petchauer and Wilson, that you answered our next question in that question, which was gonna be, what are the underutilized elements of hip hop in hip hop pedagogy? And I think we really got at that, so thank you for that. So we're opening to Q&A to make sure that folks, you know, the questions that are sitting with you from before and also during this conversation, you can ask. And I think the first question came in a while ago from Kimberly, and it connects to what Tasha just said in this chat, which is this notion of hip hop culture entering, or hip hop ed entering classrooms as workbooks, as worksheets, and then what Tasha said about liberating the classroom. And so I guess the question is, what do we do, right, with this sort of, I guess, corporatization of hip hop ed in the classroom, and how do we work with hip hop pedagogy for liberation? And it's also, everyone at this point, start to use that hand raising tool that's at the bottom, and also the Q&A box to ask your questions.
Lauren, can you say the question one more time?
Sure. So Kimberly asked, do you see a problem with the products being used just like our traditional workbooks that have been used in the past, like worksheets? And the teachers feel like they're including hip hop culture in the classrooms. And then Tasha made a comment that was, she's trying to liberate, liberate the actual environment of the classroom. So sort of connecting those two things, how do we sort of work within hip hop pedagogy, hip hop ed in a way that is liberatory and liberating and not, I guess, corporatized?
Yeah, I think that there's so much heat in that question right there, because I think that question's getting at instances when, and you know, other folks have been talking about this, that hip hop being used as this tool of like oppression as well. Whether it's you're just going to memorize this information, kind of banking students with hip hop, so or test prepping students with hip hop, or just teaching vocabulary with hip hop. I think that, so I think sometimes we can just be so excited that there's something even like remotely hip hop happening in a space. There's an impulse to just celebrate it and be super excited about it. And a hesitation to critique it or call it out because of the fear that it will go away and never come back. And I guess the question is, if we're at the point in time when we can interrogate and call out some of what we think might be more simplistic or problematic uses of hip hop, right? Whether that's, you know, like hip hop flashcards, right? Or these really set curriculum. I think that's where it's rooted in a fear of, will this, you know, do we just need to celebrate it because it's here, or can we critique it? And I think it's really important to critique it.
I would agree with Brother Petchauer in the sense, and I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but using James Banks' model of multicultural content integration, and y'all don't steal this shit because it's gonna be part of my book, right? Coming out in a year. That's a shameless plug. But to use that model, I use his model of integrating multicultural content to help folks think about the different degrees and levels to which we can design curricular interventions that are driven by hip hop, right? That it is perfectly appropriate for a contributions approach for my boys are 10 and 8, right? So to me, it's perfectly appropriate for me to buy him a children's book that tells him about the contributions of DJ Kool Herc, right? Yet, if we are in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade classrooms and only conversations we are having about Tupac Shakur is how does he contribute to blah, 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 that's terribly problematic, right? I would say a similar thing when it comes to additive approaches, right? Where in some regards, it results in culturally relevant test prep, right? And again, I hate if I lose my radical card, right? But I would not be on this webinar right now if I was not given the tools, right, to navigate that particular obstacle that is keeping me from one particular aspiration of mine, right? So again, corporate textbooks, I get a real icky feeling about that, right? But to use those approaches in certain contexts, knowing that there are other transformative and other social justice orientations and curricular interventions that can get us towards that, I think the question always comes back to why you're doing it, who are you doing it with, and what is that ultimate goal? And sometimes in some moments, my job is to help them to understand this figurative language concept. That is not the sine qua non, right? But there are levels to this ish.
Yeah, I would agree with both Dr. Hall and Dr. Petchauer. I don't have anything additional to add. I think that it's not an either or, it's a both and. Corporatization, I'm more concerned about the appropriation of it, you know, and I think we can tell, you know, when that's happening. We can tell when somebody is really just pimping out the culture and trying to, you know, get over and follow along with some sort of trend. We're trained to see the inauthenticity. We know that, like, you know, I think that goes back to a question that we had earlier about authenticity and whether or not a teacher who does not necessarily identify as a hip hop practitioner, how do they get in on the value? Well, we can peep when somebody is, you know, just like you can peep a whack MC, you can peep a whack MC, you can peep a whack teacher, you know when somebody is trying to pimp out the pedagogy. So I'm not so much against, you know, having workbooks or textbooks that are inspired by hip hop. I'm more concerned about who's writing it and who's publishing it, who's distributing it.
For us, by us.
Yeah.
Thank you. We also want to take some questions from some raised hands. So I see Kenneth Smith. You have a raised hand, so I'm going to give you the ability to, I think, say something. So go ahead. I think you might have to unmute yourself at this point, Kenneth, if you'd like to ask a question.
And real quick, everyone, we know that the session's supposed to end at 8:30 and we're a couple minutes over. So we're gonna go all the way till 8:45 for those who are able to stay. Those of you who have to go because you're in class, you're teaching a class, whatever the reason, feel free, we won't, hold it against you if you have to bounce. So just want to throw that out there.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot, Kenneth. Maybe you raised your hand by accident, but I'll give you like another 5 seconds or so if you want to say something. You have to unmute yourself in the lower left-hand corner. There you go. You there, Kenneth?
This reminds me when I had my radio show back in the day.
Right, I know, right? The dead air. Kenneth, we're going to give you one more chance, and then we might have to have you put it in the chat box for us or in the Q&A, okay? Oh, you there? All right, we're gonna have you put it in the Q&A box. And Lauren, do you have the next question in the Q&A?
Yeah, so Leisha wants to know, and forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong, how other aspects of hip hop, such as graffiti, b-boying, b-girling, we talked a lot about sort of the sonic parts of hip hop, but I think less about the sort of visually aesthetic or embodied parts. And so he wants to know, how does that fit into this conversation, into the research and the practice? So again, the question is, how do other aspects that we have not discussed of hip hop, if at all? The answer might be like, it's just not a part of hip hop, but how do those, if at all, fit into research and praxis in hip hop ed?
Yeah, I think folks have really struggled with ways to meaningfully integrate those writ large into schools, like obviously dance classes and whatnot, or music departments. There's a couple schools around here that teach beat making in their schools, and they're well-resourced schools. So this is an idea that we're bouncing around the chat about how schools compared to, say, after-school spaces are oftentimes the much more restrictive spaces, which then creates, back to this idea of narrowness, the most narrow opportunity to do hip hop based education or hip hop ed in there, and clearly the language of hip hop through songs, because it's a language and schools deal explicitly with language, is the clearest connection to have there, particularly to English language arts classes. So I think other elements like dance elements or DJing, those fit even less into the really constrained spaces of schools.
One thing that I might add is one of the first texts that I was assigned to read as part of my independent study on the initial stages of my journey to be a quote unquote hip hop scholar was Trisha Rose's Black Noise, right? And again, I see heads nodding in the congregation, right? Frankly, we can't talk no more if you don't know what the science that she's dropped. And please forgive me, it's 8:37 and my intellectual switch usually turns off 2 hours before that. But I would steal or sample the idea of her of flow, layering, and rupture, right? How that those are some tenets that regardless of the element, whether it's be MCing, whether it be DJing, whether it be graffiti, or whether it be b-boying, right? Those notions of flow, whether it is lyrical or graphic, and forgive my ignorance when it comes to the art, aesthetics of art, right? Or b-boying or graffiti, or DJing, right? That idea of flow, right? That idea of layering and that idea of rupture, right? Setting ones apart, making drastic shifts. I think that those are some through lines that can be traced across those different elements, period.
Our next question is from SIG member Stevie Johnson, and he asks, do you believe the Academy will ever accept new forms of hip hop scholarship? For example, albums or mixtapes on the same level as books / co-edited books, manuscripts, specifically if it's grounded in the firm theoretical, axiological, and methodological approaches. Okay, soon to be Dr. Johnson. So essentially, do you think the Academy will start to accept or will ever accept forms of scholarship that don't look like what we typically have, right? The manuscript with the APA or Chicago, et cetera.
Is he talking about in terms of like a dissertation or something for tenure? Can he be a little bit more specific?
And Stevie, I don't know if you're able to raise your hand and talk about this, but Stevie, I think, just finished or is in the process of finishing a dissertation that has an album component, right? Where we recorded an album that is a part, so dissertation that's an album. And so, you know, in the SIG, of course, we're like, that's amazing, but how sort of outside of this realm that we're in, how might that be accepted? Is there a place where that could be normalized, right?
I believe that it can. So, of course, we've seen dissertations that have been submitted that way. I can't remember the guy's name, but I think he was at Clemson, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of years ago, submitted like a mixtape or something as a dissertation. I don't know when that's going to happen, but I think we've seen evidence of it moving in that way, particularly around digital scholarship. So, for instance, and this goes back to just the institution and the type of leadership and the support that one gets from the institution and the vision that the institution has for itself. And Harvard might have a different vision than, University of Virginia. I don't know. I'm just throwing out different institutions. But most of the time, we find that it's the more innovative places that are setting the standard for what scholarship is considered. I think that we're going to have, of course, the traditional ways of packaging, content or packaging articles or books, but there is a line in the dossier now called digital scholarship where you're able to submit a documentary that may have been featured in different festivals and was filmed in a way that was grounded in a critical framework. You have archives or these digital products that you can actually pair with the traditional things that will allow for that type of I guess, innovation and disruption of tradition. So the long and short of it is, we've seen those boundaries being pushed. When they're going to happen or when they're just going to open on up, I'm not sure. But we see that those are things that can be paired with some of the traditional publications and things that we have to do as scholars. I'm at an institution now. This is one of the reasons why I made the pivot, because the way in which I do scholarship fits better in a school of literature, media, and communication than it does in a college or school of education. So I think it's also just, I would say to the guy that asked the question, is a lot of this is about you asking yourself, what type of scholar are you, and finding a place that fits the way in which you do scholarship. And that's been my experience. So I think that it will happen because it is happening. I'm not sure how fast, but it's going to depend on the institution.
It is happening, right? And I'm here at Westchester University. It is not a research intensive school like Georgia Tech and that other school up there in East Lansing that I don't refer to by name because I went to the University of Michigan. That's another conversation for later. Sorry about that, Emery. But to the question regarding specific to tenure, and as Emery noted, right, these are things that you negotiate, right? That at a teaching intensive institution like the one I am, that values that teaching in many ways more than a quote on scholarship, that values dissemination of real knowledge, right? I renegotiated what we call a teacher-scholar model, right? My statement of expectations, right? That I put these interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary things that I've fallen into, right? I renegotiate that statement of expectations that, yes, I was hired as English education, but since I played the game long enough, I'm in here. And now, you know what? this is how I see my job moving forward, right? In that context, we talk about reimagining what scholarship means, right? And we put on paper that if I'm doing a podcast, right? And again, if it's about, and again, in my university, dissemination of real knowledge, right? I use their language against them to say that I'm going to design this podcast that is going to be called Building a School of Angelic Troublemakers, right? And this is what we're doing. And again, I'm going to be able to present them with, knock on wood, a different kind of data. And yes, it may be a little neoliberally, right? But the important thing is to know how my performance is being assessed, right? To be confident and convicted enough to argue for what your value and your contributions are, and making sure you're in the right type of spaces that are conducive to that, right? Or in my situation, I didn't think this was possible, but the more I think about it, I'm willing to bet that an institution like mine is more willing to these non-traditional notions of scholarship than Georgia Tech or Michigan State would be, because they operate with a different currency.
Yeah.
So folks, I know we're at the end of our time here. Tasha, you read my mind. So this is the first, thank you for joining everyone, in a webinar series that the Hip Hop SIG is hosting. And so some of the other webinars we'll have will include more practitioner focused. What does this look like, right? What do we do in the classroom? Also research-based webinars. How do we do research around hip hop ed? What kind of research is needed so we're not just sort of spinning the same wheel? And then also, how do we develop conference proposals, right? So I don't know, I know Dr. Petchauer, you take your students to NCTE. I don't know if you all are coming to NCTE from Westchester, but something to think about also is how do we develop these proposals? How do we work together collaboratively? And so those will all be included in our series. If you have suggestions for things that you'd like to see in our series, please email us and we'll work on that. And of course, Tasha, yes, how do you get tenure and a job as a hip hop ed scholar? Any last good nights, comments, peace from anyone?
I was gonna say real quick, for those of you who do the AERA thing, definitely, if you're not a member, join the AERA and then become a SIG member. When you join the SIG, that helps us grow. So please, if that's your thing, please officially join the SIG.
The SIG will not exist without members. The SIG will not exist if there are not members. It will go away. It will cease to exist. It will be RIP. Join the SIG if you're part of AERA.
Thank you. Thank you very much. At AERA, we're going to have 5 different presentation sessions. We'll have a business meeting, and we're in the midst of planning an offsite event with some local educators. We'll get you more details on that soon. So we're ramping up a lot of activities coming up in these next month or so. So thanks for all that. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they want to say.
I do. I would say this. Education is broad, and it exists outside of colleges of education. And so I would say to anybody on the call who's really trying to think about where they fit in all of this, consider joining programs in schools that may not be education, but where you can still do the work around hip hop and pedagogy and education. So I would throw that out there as, I don't know if there's anybody on the call that's really just kind of thinking about, if I do this work, do I have to do it K through 12? Do I have to do it at a college of education or a school of education? And the answer is no. So just think about where where you fit and who you are as a scholar and where you want to see yourself.
Thank you. On that note, I think we're gonna end it. Thank you so much, Dr. Petchauer, Dr. Hall, Dr. Wilson. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. We hope we're gonna keep more webinars coming soon. We hope to engage all of you, either in person or on the interwebs or whatever. So thanks everybody, and have a great night.
Don't forget, everyone, at 9 o'clock tonight,
you.
the hashtag Hip Hop Ed Twitter chat begins in about 15 minutes. So if you're on the computer, hop onto that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Night.
All right. Good night.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Peace.